The bus station was the last place I expected my life to change. It wasn't one of those picturesque stops you see in travel brochures, just a row of worn benches under a flickering streetlight, surrounded by the dull hum of cars passing by. I waited there every evening after work, blending into the crowd of tired commuters. It was routine, predictable, unremarkable. Until I saw her. It was raining that day, one of those relentless downpours that left the world soaked and dreary. I noticed her sitting on a bench, struggling with a broken umbrella. She wore a beige trench coat, damp at the edges, and her red hair clung to her face. Despite her disheveled state, she had an air of quiet grace. I don't know what compelled me to approach her. Maybe it was how she sighed, as if carrying the weight of something far heavier than the rain. "Here," I said, offering my umbrella. "Looks like yours has seen better days." She looked up, startled, her green eyes locking onto mine. For a moment I thought she might refuse, but then she smiled, a soft, hesitant curve of her lips. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm despite the chill in the air. We stood there, awkwardly sharing the umbrella as we waited for the bus. She introduced herself as Olivia. Her voice carried a lilting melody, the kind that made you want to keep listening. She mentioned she'd forgotten her car at home because her husband had taken it to work. "Rough day?" I asked, noticing the way her shoulders tensed when she mentioned him. She nodded but didn't elaborate. Instead, she shifted the focus back to me, asking about my job, routine, and life. I found myself sharing more than I intended, caught in the pull of her quiet curiosity. The bus arrived, cutting our conversation short. As we boarded, she glanced back, her eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer than necessary. The following days were a blur of anticipation. I found myself hoping she'd be at the station again, though I told myself it was just idle curiosity. When she did appear a week later, I couldn't hide my smile. "You again," she teased, her tone light but her gaze searching. From that moment, our conversations became a regular occurrence. We talked about everything and nothing: books we'd read, places we'd been, dreams we'd shelved. She never mentioned her husband unless prompted, and even then, her answers were clipped, as if the topic was too heavy to unpack. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the bus station emptied, she opened up just a little. "Ethan works a lot," she said, tracing a pattern on the bench with her finger. "He's dedicated to his job." I didn't press her for details, but the way she said it spoke volumes. It wasn't just the long hours or the demands of being married to a police officer. There was something deeper, something unspoken. "You deserve someone who listens," I said, surprising even myself with the boldness of my words. Her eyes met mine, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her face before she quickly looked away. The turning point came on a rainy night, much like the first time we met. We were the only two people at the station, huddled under the same umbrella again. The conversation had stalled, replaced by the rhythm of raindrops against the metal roof. "I don't know why I keep coming here," she admitted suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at her, unsure how to respond. Before I could say anything, she turned to me, her expression raw and unguarded. "Do you ever feel trapped?" she asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and laden with meaning. I wanted to say no, but the truth was, I did. I felt trapped by the monotony of my days, by the lack of connection in my life. And in that moment I realized she wasn't just asking about herself, she was asking about us. "Maybe," I said, my voice steady but my heart racing. She smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "I shouldn't be here," she said, standing abruptly as the bus pulled into the station. "Olivia," I started, but she was already stepping away, leaving me with nothing but the fading sound of her name on my lips. As the bus pulled away, I sat on the bench alone, the rain soaking through my coat. I knew this wasn't the end, though. It felt like the beginning of something I couldn't quite name, but couldn't deny. The world might see her as a devoted wife to a respected officer, but I'd seen the cracks in that image. And now, I couldn't stop wondering how deep they ran. I told myself to let it go. She was married, after all, and to a cop no less. But the days that followed felt strangely empty, like something important had slipped through my fingers. I avoided the bus station, taking earlier routes or working late to dodge the hours we'd usually meet. Yet fate, or something more dangerous, had other plans. One evening, nearly 2 weeks later, I was walking home from the grocery store when I saw her. She was sitting on a park bench, her coat pulled tight against the wind. She looked up as I approached, her face lighting up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey," she said softly. "Olivia," I said, surprised to see her outside of the bus station. "What are you doing here?" She shrugged. I needed some air. And maybe her voice trailed off as she hesitated, then continued. "Maybe I was hoping to run into you." I stood there, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to walk away, to avoid the complications that her presence seemed to promise. But another part, the part that had been thinking about her every day since our last meeting, couldn't leave. "Do you have time to sit?" she asked, motioning to the bench beside her. I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Our conversation started casually, like the ones we'd had at the bus station. She asked about my week, and I told her about work, avoiding the way my pulse quickened just by being near her. But as the evening deepened, so did our talk. "I've been thinking about what you said," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the park's empty paths. What I said. About deserving someone who listens. Her voice was barely audible, but her words hit like a confession. I didn't know how to respond. The truth was, I'd been thinking about her too, about her laughter, her sadness, the way she seemed to bring color into my otherwise gray world. But saying that felt dangerous, like crossing an invisible line. "Ethan's a good man," she continued, as if trying to convince herself. "He works hard, and he's respected. But sometimes I feel like I'm invisible." "You're not invisible," I said before I could stop myself. She turned to me then, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name: gratitude, longing, maybe both. And before I knew it, we were closer than we'd ever been, her face only inches from mine. "This is wrong," she whispered, even as she leaned in. "Tell me to stop," I said, though I knew she wouldn't. She didn't. Our lips met in a kiss that was both tender and desperate, the kind that seemed to carry the weight of all the things we couldn't say. For a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. It was just her and me, two people trying to fill the empty spaces in their lives. When we finally pulled away, her cheeks were flushed, her breath unsteady. "I shouldn't have done that," she said, standing abruptly. "Olivia." "I have to go," she interrupted, gathering her things and walking away before I could stop her. I sat there, staring after her, torn between guilt and the undeniable pull I felt toward her. I knew I should let her go, that chasing after a married woman, especially one married to a police officer, was a recipe for disaster. But as I walked home that night, her kiss still lingering on my lips, I realized something. I didn't want to let her go. The next time I saw her, it was back at the bus station. She didn't sit with me right away, instead pacing as she waited for the bus. When she finally did come over, she avoided my eyes. "About the other night," she began. "You don't have to explain," I said quickly. "If you regret it, I'll understand." She shook her head. "It's not that simple." "Then tell me," I urged. She hesitated, then sighed. "I'm not happy, but leaving Ethan isn't an option. He's complicated." "Complicated how?" She didn't answer right away, her fingers twisting in her lap. "He has a temper," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. My stomach tightened. "Does he hurt you?" "No," she said quickly, though her hesitation made me doubt her. "But he can be intense, and I can't risk him finding out about us." I reached for her hand, surprised when she let me. "Olivia, you don't have to stay with him if you're unhappy. You deserve better." She smiled sadly. "It's not that simple." Despite her words, our relationship deepened. We found ways to meet in secret at the park, in quiet coffee shops, even at my apartment when we could risk it. Each time I told myself it would be the last, but each time I couldn't stay away. She was like a flame, beautiful and dangerous, and I was a moth drawn to her light. But the closer we got, the more I realized how fragile our situation was. Ethan wasn't just a name in our conversations anymore, he was a shadow looming over everything, a constant reminder of the risk we were taking. And though neither of us said it aloud, we both knew it was only a matter of time before he found out. The more time I spent with Olivia, the harder it became to ignore the risks. We were careful, meeting only in places where no one would recognize her. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was the shadow of her husband, Ethan, a man I'd never met but felt I knew all too well through her stories. Ethan wasn't just a police officer, he was sharp, methodical, and fiercely protective of his image. Olivia spoke of him in fragments: his dedication to his job, his intimidating presence, the way he controlled every aspect of their home life. And though she denied any physical abuse, her hesitation when discussing him told a different story. "You shouldn't worry about him," she told me one evening as we sat on a secluded park bench. "How can I not?" I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. "You're married to a cop, Olivia. If he finds out..." She reached for my hand, her touch soft but firm. "He won't. I won't let him." Her confidence was both reassuring and unsettling. I wanted to believe her, to trust that we could keep our secret hidden. But deep down, I knew we were playing a dangerous game, and every move we made brought us closer to the edge. One afternoon, we decided to meet at my apartment, a small, nondescript space on the edge of town. It wasn't ideal, but the risk of being seen in public had grown too great. Olivia arrived dressed casually, her hair tucked under a baseball cap, sunglasses shielding her face. She looked nothing like the polished woman I'd first met at the bus station, but her beauty was undeniable. "I feel like a fugitive," she joked as she stepped inside. I tried to smile, but the tension in my chest wouldn't loosen. "You're sure Ethan doesn't suspect anything?" She shook her head. "He thinks I'm at a book club." Her nonchalance made me uneasy, but I pushed the thought aside as she wrapped her arms around me. For a while, we forgot the world outside, losing ourselves in the comfort of each other's company. But as the hours passed, reality crept back in. She checked her phone frequently, her expression tightening each time it buzzed. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "It's just Ethan," she said, slipping the phone into her bag. "He's asking when I'll be home." I frowned. "Maybe you shouldn't stay too long." She hesitated, then nodded. "You're right. I should go." I walked her to the door, my heart heavy with the weight of our situation. As she stepped outside, she turned back, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and fear. "I'll call you," she said before disappearing down the hallway. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I imagined Ethan knocking on my door, his badge gleaming, his voice cold and authoritative. By morning, my nerves were frayed. I decided to call Olivia, just to make sure she was okay. The phone rang twice before she answered, her voice low and tense. "Is everything all right?" I asked. "Ethan was waiting for me when I got home," she said. Her words rushed. "He asked why I was late." "What did you tell him?" "I said the book club ran long," she replied. "He didn't press further, but I think he's suspicious." A cold knot formed in my stomach. Maybe we should stop seeing each other for a while. "No," she said quickly. "I can handle this. I just need to be more careful." Her determination both impressed and frightened me. She was willing to risk everything: her safety, her reputation, even her marriage for the moments we shared. But was I? The next few weeks passed in a haze of stolen moments and mounting tension. We became more cautious, avoiding familiar places and limiting our contact. But no matter how careful we were, the feeling of being watched never left me. One evening, as I walked home from work, I noticed a car idling near the corner of my street. It was a black sedan, the kind that blended in easily but felt out of place. I slowed my pace, glancing over my shoulder. The car didn't move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was inside, watching me. By the time I reached my apartment, my pulse was racing. I locked the door behind me, double-checking the windows before collapsing onto the couch. I debated calling Olivia but decided against it. If Ethan was onto us, I didn't want to give him any more reason to suspect. Still, the unease lingered, a constant reminder of the fine line we were walking. Late that night, my phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. "Can we meet tomorrow? There's something I need to tell you." I stared at the screen, my mind racing with possibilities. What could she possibly have to say that couldn't wait? As I typed my reply, a single thought echoed in my mind. We were running out of time. The next day, I met Olivia at the park. She was already waiting, seated on our usual bench beneath the sprawling oak tree. Her sunglasses obscured her eyes, but the tension in her posture told me everything I needed to know. "What's going on?" I asked, sitting beside her. She glanced around nervously before removing her sunglasses. Her eyes were rimmed with red, as though she hadn't slept. "Ethan knows something," she said quietly. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "He's been asking questions," she explained. "About where I've been, who I've been spending time with. Last night he went through my phone." My pulse quickened. "Did he find anything?" "No," she said quickly. "I've been careful. I delete everything. But he's watching me now closer than ever. He even suggested driving me to my book club next time." The air between us grew heavy with unspoken fears. I knew this moment would come eventually, but hearing it aloud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. "Olivia," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me, "maybe it's time to end this." Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "End this? You can't mean that." "I'm worried about you," I admitted. "And honestly, I'm worried about me too. If Ethan finds out, we're both—" "I can handle him," she interrupted, her voice fierce. "I've handled him for years." "But at what cost?" I countered. "Is this worth risking everything?" She looked away, her hands trembling in her lap. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The distant sounds of children playing and birds chirping felt jarringly out of place against the weight of our conversation. "I can't lose you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. Despite everything, despite the danger and the lies, I couldn't deny how deeply I'd fallen for her. But love wasn't enough to shield us from the consequences of our actions. "We need to be smart about this," I said, reaching for her hand. "If Ethan's already suspicious, then we need to lay low at least for a while." She nodded reluctantly, though her grip on my hand tightened. The following days were torturous. We stopped meeting in person, limiting our contact to brief, coded messages that offered little reassurance. Every moment felt like walking on a tightrope, the threat of discovery looming over us like a dark cloud. Then, one evening, Olivia called me. Her voice was shaky, and I could hear the faint hum of a television in the background. "Ethan's been acting different," she said. "What do you mean?" I asked, my throat tightening. "He's calmer than usual." "Too calm," she explained. "It's like he's trying to lull me into a false sense of security." "Do you think he knows?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But he's been making comments, little things that make me wonder if he's testing me." I rubbed a hand over my face, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "You need to be careful, Olivia, if he's onto us." A loud crash interrupted our conversation, followed by Ethan's voice calling her name. "I have to go," she whispered before the line went dead. I sat there, staring at my phone, the unease in my chest turning into full-blown panic. The next morning, I received a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the park at noon. Don't tell anyone." I knew it was Olivia. The secrecy of the message only added to my growing sense of dread. When I arrived at the park, she was pacing near the bench, her hands buried in the pockets of her coat. Her usual calm demeanor was replaced by a frantic energy that set me on edge. "What happened last night?" I asked as I approached. She stopped pacing and looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "Ethan found a receipt," she said. "A receipt for what?" "For the coffee shop where we met last week," she explained. "He said he doesn't remember me mentioning it, and now he's asking who I was with." "Did you tell him anything?" "Of course not," she said quickly. "But he didn't believe me. He said he'd get to the bottom of it." My heart pounded in my chest. This is bad, Olivia. If he starts digging. "I know," she interrupted, her voice cracking. "That's why I need your help." "Help with what?" She hesitated, her eyes darting around the park. "I need to get away from him," she said finally. "Just for a little while. Until things cool down." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Olivia, running away will only make him more suspicious." "I don't have a choice," she insisted. "If he finds out about us." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. As we discussed her plan, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already in over our heads. Every decision we made seemed to dig us deeper into a hole we couldn't climb out of. But despite my fears, I couldn't say no to her. Because the truth was, I'd rather risk everything than lose her. Olivia's plan was simple in theory but fraught with risks. She wanted to stay at a motel on the outskirts of town for a few days, using her book club as a cover story. She'd already packed a small bag, hidden away in the trunk of her car, ready to go. "I'll tell Ethan there's a weekend retreat," she explained as we sat in my apartment, our voices low. "He won't think twice about it." I nodded, though doubt gnawed at me. "And if he checks? Calls one of your so-called book club friends?" "I've thought of that," she said quickly. "He doesn't know anyone from the group. It's safe." Safe. The words sounded hollow. Nothing about this situation felt safe. "When are you planning to leave?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning," she replied, her gaze meeting mine. "But I need your help. I can't do this alone." My chest tightened. I wanted to say yes, to be the person she could count on. But the risks were enormous. If Ethan found out, it wouldn't just be Olivia who paid the price, it would be both of us. Still, I couldn't abandon her. "I'll help you," I said finally. Relief washed over her face, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe we might pull this off. The next day, Olivia sent me a message leaving now. "Meet me at the gas station off Route 5. I drove there in a haze of nerves, scanning every car in my rearview mirror for signs of a tail. When I arrived, Olivia was already waiting, her car parked at the far end of the lot. She stepped out as I pulled up beside her, her face pale but determined. "Everything okay?" I asked. "For now," she said. "Ethan left for work before I did. I don't think he suspects anything." We didn't linger. After a quick exchange, I followed her car out of the lot, keeping a cautious distance as we headed toward the motel she'd booked. The motel was small and unremarkable, the kind of place where people came to disappear. Olivia checked in under a fake name, using cash to avoid leaving a paper trail. As we stepped into the room, I couldn't help but notice how sparse it was: just a bed, a chair, and a tiny TV mounted on the wall. "This is it," she said, dropping her bag onto the bed. I nodded, my unease growing. "What's the plan now?" "I stay here for a few days, maybe a week," she said, "until I'm sure Ethan stopped asking questions." "And what about us?" She looked at me, her expression softening. "We'll be careful. I'll call you when it's safe to meet again." Her words were meant to reassure me, but they didn't. Every second we spent apart felt like an eternity, and the thought of her returning to Ethan made my stomach churn. That night I barely slept. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios: Ethan showing up at the motel, Olivia's cover story unraveling, the two of us being exposed. When my phone buzzed in the early hours of the morning, my heart leapt to my throat. It was a message from Olivia. He called me. Said he was coming home early. I think he's on to me. Panic surged through me. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. I threw on my clothes and grabbed my keys, my mind racing. If Ethan was coming for her, I couldn't just sit by and do nothing. When I arrived at the motel, the parking lot was eerily quiet. Olivia's car was parked near the entrance, but there was no sign of her. I knocked on the door to her room, my heart pounding. "Olivia, it's me," I said. The door opened a crack, and her face appeared, pale and shaken. "He's here," she whispered, pulling me inside. "What? How?" "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. I looked out the window, and I saw his car. My pulse thundered in my ears. "Did he see you?" "I don't think so," she said. "But he's looking for me. I know it." We both froze as the sound of a car engine grew louder, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. "He's here," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. I glanced around the room, my mind racing. We had to act fast. "Stay here," I said. "What?" "No," she hissed, grabbing my arm. "You can't." Before she could finish, a loud knock echoed through the room, followed by a voice that made my blood run cold. "Olivia? I know you're in there." "Ethan." The room seemed to shrink as Ethan's voice echoed outside the door. Olivia clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Her eyes were wide with fear, and I could feel her trembling. "What do we do?" she whispered. My mind raced. Running wasn't an option. There was nowhere to go without him seeing us. And if he knew she was here, it wouldn't take him long to piece everything together. The knock came again. Louder this time. "Olivia, open the door," Ethan demanded, his tone calm but laced with menace. "We need to talk." I stepped closer to the window and peeked through the curtain. His car was parked directly in front of the room, the engine still running. He stood outside, his shadowed figure tall and imposing. "Stay in the bathroom," I said quickly, turning to Olivia. "What?" "Hide in the bathroom," I repeated. "Lock the door. Let me handle this." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You can't face him alone. Can Trust me," I cut her off, my voice firm. "If he sees you, this will only get worse." She hesitated, her breathing shallow, before nodding reluctantly. She retreated to the bathroom, closing the door softly behind her. I took a deep breath, my heart hammering in my chest, and opened the door. Ethan stood there, his expression unreadable. He was dressed in his police uniform, the badge glinting in the dim light. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. His eyes narrowed as he looked me over, then passed me into the room. "Where's Olivia?" he asked. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, standing my ground. His lips curled into a humorless smile. "Don't play dumb with me. Her car's parked outside, and this is her room. So I'll ask again, where is she?" "She's not here," I said firmly. "You must be mistaken." Ethan took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "I'm only going to ask one more time," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "Where is my wife?" Before I could respond, the bathroom door creaked open, and Olivia stepped out. "Ethan, stop," she said, her voice trembling. He turned to her, his eyes dark with fury. "So it's true," he said, his voice cold. "You're hiding here. With him." Olivia moved closer, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "It's not what you think," she said quickly. "Not what I think," he repeated, laughing bitterly. "You've been sneaking around for weeks, lying to my face, and now I find you here. Do you expect me to believe nothing is going on?" "Ethan, please," she pleaded. "Let me explain." But he wasn't listening. His gaze shifted to me, his jaw tightening. "And you," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "What kind of man goes after another man's wife?" I opened my mouth to speak, but Olivia stepped between us. "Ethan, stop," she said again, her voice stronger this time. "This is my fault. I'm the one who. Don't defend him, Ethan shouted, his composure cracking. The tension in the room was suffocating. I could feel the weight of his anger, his betrayal, and the realization that everything he thought he knew about his wife was a lie. Ethan's hand moved to his belt, and my stomach dropped when I saw the glint of his holstered gun. Ethan, I said carefully, raising my hands, let's talk about this. No one wants things to get out of hand. He looked at me with a mixture of rage and disgust. You don't get to tell me what to do, he said, his voice low and menacing. Ethan, listen to me, Olivia said, stepping closer to him. You're angry and you have every right to be. But this isn't the way to handle it. For a moment it looked like he might listen. His hand hovered over the gun, his breathing heavy. But then his eyes hardened. You think you can betray me and walk away unscathed, he said, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. Time seemed to slow as he reached for his weapon. Ethan, no, Olivia screamed, lunging toward him. I didn't think, I just acted. Grabbing the nearest object, a heavy lamp from the bedside table, I swung it with all my strength. The lamp connected with Ethan's shoulder, sending him stumbling backward. The gun fell from his hand, clattering to the floor. Olivia grabbed it and pointed it at him, her hands trembling. Don't make me use this, she said, her voice shaking but resolute. Ethan froze, his eyes wide with shock. For the first time, the power dynamic shifted. Olivia, he said, his tone softer now, almost pleading, put the gun down. Let's talk. No, she said firmly. You're not in control anymore. The three of us stood there in a tense standoff, the weight of everything crashing down around us. This was no longer just a messy affair, it was a powder keg ready to explode. I had no idea how we were going to get out of this alive. The room fell silent, except for Olivia's shaky breaths and Ethan's labored ones. She kept the gun aimed at him, her hands trembling but her resolve clear. Olivia, Ethan said again, his voice pleading now, you don't have to do this. Put the gun down and we can talk. I love you. Her face twisted in pain, but she didn't lower the weapon. You don't love me, she said, her voice breaking. You control me. You suffocate me. And now you show up here to do what, Ethan? Intimidate me? Hurt me? He flinched, as though her words struck harder than the lamp I'd used. Olivia, please, he started, but she cut him off. No, she shouted, stepping closer, the barrel of the gun now inches from his chest. You don't get to twist this around. You don't get to play the victim. I stood frozen, watching the scene unfold, unsure of what to do. My heart raced, the stakes higher than ever. Ethan shifted slightly, his eyes flicking toward the door. I caught the movement and stepped forward. Don't even think about it, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. Ethan's gaze darted back to Olivia, calculating. What's your plan here, he asked, his tone bitter. You think you're going to just walk away from this? From me? Yes, Olivia said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. That's exactly what I'm going to do. The tension was unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on all of us. Finally, Olivia motioned toward the door with the gun. Leave, she said. Ethan didn't move. Ethan, she said, her voice rising. Leave now, or I swear I'll. You won't, he interrupted, his voice soft but cold. You don't have it in you. Her hand trembled, but she didn't lower the weapon. Try me, she said, her voice like steel. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, as if searching for a weakness. Then, with a frustrated sigh, he raised his hands and took a step back. This isn't over, he said, his tone dark and foreboding. He turned and left the room, slamming the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Olivia's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, the gun slipping from her hands. I rushed to her side, pulling her into my arms as she sobbed. It's okay, I whispered. though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. "You're safe now." But was she? Was either of us? After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, Olivia pulled herself together. She wiped her tears and looked at me with a mixture of determination and desperation. "We can't stay here," she said. "He'll come back." She was right. Ethan wasn't the type to let this go. If we stayed, we were sitting ducks. "We need to leave town," I said. Olivia nodded, already moving to gather her things. "I know a place," she said. "It's far enough away that he won't find us right away." I hesitated. "Olivia, are you sure about this? Once we leave, there's no going back." She met my gaze, her eyes filled with both fear and resolve. "I'm sure," she said. "I can't go back to him. Not after this." We packed quickly and left the motel under the cover of darkness. I followed her car down the highway, my mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. Every mile we put between ourselves and Ethan felt like a small victory, but the weight of what we were doing, what we'd done, hung heavy over us. We were running, not just from Ethan, but from the lives we'd known. And while part of me was terrified, another part couldn't ignore the strange sense of freedom that came with it. The drive was long and silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. When we finally reached our destination, a small cabin tucked away in the woods, exhaustion overtook us. "We'll be safe here," Olivia said, as we stepped inside. I wanted to believe her, but deep down I knew this wasn't the end. Ethan wouldn't give up easily, and our escape was only the beginning of a new, more dangerous game. The cabin was silent, surrounded by nothing but thick woods and the distant hum of insects. It felt like we were in a different world entirely, far removed from the chaos we'd left behind. Olivia sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the darkness outside. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she gripped the mug of tea I had made her. "Do you think he'll come after us?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to lie to her. "Yes," I said, "but not right away. He'll have to be careful. He's a cop, he can't just act without consequences." She nodded, though her expression didn't change. "He's not going to let me go, you know. He'll come eventually." I walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to reassure her even though I shared the same fear. "We'll figure it out. Together." The first few days at the cabin were uneventful, but the tension between the U.S. grew heavier with each passing hour. Olivia barely spoke, her mind clearly preoccupied with thoughts of Ethan and what might come next. I tried to keep busy, making the place as secure as possible and ensuring we had enough supplies. On the third night, Olivia finally opened up. "I never wanted it to get this far," she said, sitting across from me at the small wooden table. "I thought I could manage it, balance my life with Ethan and whatever this thing between us is." "It's not just a thing," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. "You know that." She looked away, her fingers tracing patterns on the table. Maybe I wanted to believe that. But now, I don't know. Everything is so messed up. Ethan, he's not just going to give up, and I don't know how to stop him. I reached for her hand, but she pulled away, standing abruptly. "I need some air," she said, walking toward the door. She was gone longer than I expected. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin, and found her sitting on the porch steps, staring up at the stars. "I didn't mean to push you," I said, sitting beside her. She shook her head. "It's not you. It's everything. I'm scared, and I don't know if I can handle this." "We'll get through it," I said. "I won't let anything happen to you." She turned to me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You can't promise that." As the days turned into a week, we began to settle into a fragile routine. Olivia seemed calmer, though the shadow of Ethan's presence never truly left her. I thought we might have bought ourselves some time until the call came. The cabin's landline phone rang late one evening, its shrill tone breaking the silence. My heart jumped into my throat as I exchanged a glance with Olivia. "Don't answer it," she said, her voice trembling. but I was already moving toward it. If it was Ethan, I needed to know. I picked up the receiver, my hand shaking. "Hello, Renee." There was a pause, and then his voice came through, calm and measured. "You thought you could hide her from me," Ethan said. My blood ran cold. "How did you?" "It doesn't matter how," he interrupted. "What matters is that you listened carefully. Olivia is my wife. You had no right to take her from me." "She's not property," I said, anger flaring despite my fear. "She's mine," he said, his voice hardening. "And I'm coming to get her." The line went dead. I turned to Olivia, who was standing in the doorway, her face pale. "What did he say?" she asked, though I could tell she already knew. "He knows where we are," I said. Her knees buckled, and I caught her before she fell. "We have to go," I said, my mind racing. Now. Packing was frantic. We grabbed only the essentials, stuffing them into bags as quickly as we could. I kept an eye on the road, expecting Ethan's car to appear at any moment. "We can't keep running forever," Olivia said, as we loaded the car. "We don't have a choice," I replied. As we pulled away from the cabin, leaving behind the brief sanctuary it had provided, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. We drove for hours, the headlights slicing through the darkness, the roads long and unfamiliar. The silence between us was thick, as if words would somehow make everything worse. Olivia sat beside me, her face drawn and pale, her hands tightly clutching the bag in her lap. "We need a plan," I said, breaking the silence. "I know," Olivia replied softly, her voice distant. "But I don't know what kind of plan we can have. Ethan won't stop until he finds me. He's relentless." I could hear the fear in her voice, and it made my chest tighten. I didn't know how to fix this. I didn't know how to protect her from someone who had the power to control everything: the law, the people in his life, even the systems that could keep us safe. "We'll find somewhere safe," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "We just need to keep moving." We made it through the night without any signs of pursuit. The next morning we pulled into a small, nearly deserted town, a place that seemed off the radar. I hoped it would be enough to put some distance between us and Ethan. The town was quiet, the streets lined with old buildings that hadn't seen much change in decades. It looked like the kind of place where people came to hide from the rest of the world. I parked the car in a lot behind a cafe, and we sat in the car for a moment, weighing our options. "I think we should lay low for a while," I suggested. "Find a place to stay somewhere no one will recognize us." Olivia nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on the horizon, as if she were looking for something or someone. "I'm scared," she said after a long pause. "I feel like we're just running away from him. Like I'm never going to be free." "You are free," I said firmly. "You just need to believe it. We both do." She looked at me, her eyes searching my face. "But can we ever really escape him? Will he ever let us go?" I didn't have an answer. We spent the next few days in the town, renting a small apartment on the outskirts. The place was nondescript, just an old two-story building with faded paint and a crooked sign. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small victory. Olivia did her best to settle in, though I could see the worry in her eyes every time a car drove by. We kept the blinds closed, avoiding the streets, and only went out after dark, staying hidden in the shadows. The fear, however, never fully left her. One night, while I was out buying groceries, I returned to find Olivia pacing in the living room, her face pale. "He's here," she said, her voice tight. "I saw him outside." My heart skipped a beat. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her eyes wide with panic. "I saw his car. I saw him. He was standing in the shadows, just watching the apartment building. He knows where we are." I grabbed my jacket and rushed to the window. Sure enough, I saw a dark figure lingering near the corner of the building. The dim light reflected off the tinted windows of his car. "He's not just going to go away," I said, feeling the cold grip of fear tightening around me. Olivia turned away, her hands shaking as she clutched her chest. "What do we do now?" "We can't stay here," I said. "We need to leave. Now." We packed in a frenzy, moving faster than we had the first time, knowing that time was no longer a luxury we had. I grabbed the essentials, stuffing them into bags, while Olivia checked out the window every few seconds, her eyes wide with dread. I could feel the weight of the situation crashing down on me. This wasn't just about us anymore. This was about survival. As we rushed down the stairs and out of the apartment building, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced over at Olivia, who was walking beside me, her steps quick but unsteady. "Stay close," I told her, my voice low. We moved quickly through the darkened streets, avoiding any areas where we might be seen. The town felt like it was closing in around us, the streets empty except for the occasional stray car. We reached my car, parked around the corner from the apartment. As I opened the door, I noticed a shadow moving in the distance. I couldn't make out the figure, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "Get in the car," I said, my voice urgent. We both jumped into the car, and I started the engine, pulling out of the parking lot as quickly as I could. As we drove through the winding streets, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A car was following us. It wasn't just any car, it was his. "Ethan's on our tail," I muttered under my breath. Olivia's face went white as she turned to look at me. "What do we do?" I gripped the wheel tighter, my mind racing for a plan. We can't keep running forever, but we need to lose him first. The car behind us was close now, the headlights a steady presence in the rearview mirror. I could see Ethan's car clearly, its dark silhouette reflecting the dim streetlights as we wound through the quiet roads. My pulse raced, and for a moment it felt as though the world had narrowed down to just that moment, just the distance between us and Ethan. "Stay calm," I said, trying to steady my nerves. "I know a way to lose him." Olivia nodded, her hands pressed against the seat, her knuckles white. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if he catches us?" "We won't let him," I said firmly, even though a part of me wasn't entirely sure. I veered off the main road, taking a sharp turn onto a narrow, winding street. The tires squealed slightly, but I kept my foot on the accelerator. "What are you doing?" Olivia asked, a note of panic creeping into her voice. "We're losing him," I said. "Stay with me." I floored the gas pedal, pushing the car faster as we zigzagged through the side streets, cutting through alleys and taking sharp turns. The car behind us struggled to keep up, its headlights flickering in and out of view. We were heading into unfamiliar territory, and I hoped it was enough to lose him. The night air whipped through the cracks in the windows, and the sound of the tires on the road became the only thing I could hear, a constant hum that matched the racing of my heart. I glanced at Olivia. She was gripping the seat, her eyes wide, but she wasn't saying anything. She trusted me, and I knew she was holding her breath, hoping I could make this work. I took another turn, this one even sharper than the last. The car behind us was still there, but it was falling behind now. I could see its headlights getting fainter. We were gaining distance. "Hold on," I said, my voice low and urgent. "We're almost there." I knew the area. It was a maze of back roads and industrial zones. If I could get us to the old warehouse district, we might have a chance. It was the perfect place to hide isolated, with very few people around at night. I just needed to get there before Ethan could catch up. The car behind us was still visible, but it was slowing down now. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't let up now. We finally reached the warehouse district, a maze of old, abandoned buildings that looked like something out of a movie. I slammed the brakes and pulled the car into a darkened alley between two warehouses, cutting off the headlights and turning off the engine. We sat in the darkness, breathing heavily, listening to the faint sound of Ethan's car as it passed by the street in front of us. "He's gone," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Olivia let out a long breath, slumping against the seat. We did it." "We did," I said, though the relief I felt was mixed with dread. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. We waited in silence, listening for any sign of Ethan. but the night seemed still, the only sound the occasional rustling of wind against the metal of the buildings around us. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly opened the door and stepped outside, motioning for Olivia to stay put. I walked to the edge of the alley, peering around the corner to check if anyone was coming. The street was empty, the silence almost eerie. "He's gone," I said, coming back to the car. Olivia exhaled sharply, her body sinking into the seat as if the tension had drained out of her. "What now?" she asked. I took a deep breath. "We keep moving. We can't stop. We need to find somewhere permanent, somewhere he won't think to look." The next few days were a blur of motion, of staying in cheap motels and dodging the occasional curious glance from locals. We were constantly looking over our shoulders, never staying in one place for too long. Every time we heard a siren in the distance, my heart would race. I knew Ethan was still out there, still searching. But we kept our distance, sticking to the back roads and taking care not to attract attention. Olivia stayed quiet for most of it, lost in her thoughts, but I could see the cracks in her composure. The fear had never fully left her. And yet, despite everything, we managed to keep one step ahead of him. One evening, after another long day of driving, we found a small town just on the edge of a forest. It felt safer than anywhere we'd been in a while. The people here seemed kind, and the place was quiet. We rented a room at a modest motel, the kind with peeling paint and a sign that flickered occasionally. I knew this wouldn't be the end, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. We were together, we were alive, and we had made it this far. As I sat in the room, watching Olivia drift off to sleep on the bed, I couldn't help but think about what we had become. There was no going back to our old lives. The world we had known had been turned upside down, and Ethan had made sure of that. But I didn't regret it. Not when I looked at her, when I saw the strength in her eyes, the way she had fought for us, for a life that had seemed impossible. She was my life now, and no matter what happened, I would protect her. But even as I held her close that night, I knew the worst was still to come.